As the dust settles on Star Trek, Section 31, it feels safe to say the newest Star Trek movie was, broadly, a big Star Trek disappointment. For one, Section 31 bucked Star Trek movie tradition by not centering on a starship. For another, despite focusing on the morally grey Starfleet agency, Section 31, the actual actions of Emperor Philippa Georgiou, Michelle Yeoh, and other characters in Section 31 weren't actually morally complex. But from the beginning to the ending of Section 31, the biggest problem for the movie was how its fight choreographer-centered filming made it feel more like a generic action movie than a Star Trek movie. But the fact that Section 31 was an unsatisfying movie does not necessarily mean bad things for Star Trek as a franchise. In 2024, Star Trek: Lower Decks concluded on a high note. Another fan favorite, Star Trek: Strange New Worlds, has been renewed for 2 more seasons, and the first is expected this year. And Paramount also gave the upcoming show, Star Trek: Starfleet Academy, a renewal for 2 seasons. Finally, on the movie front, there is a planned movie focusing on Starfleet's origins in the works, which could redeem Star Trek movies for the current era of Trek. Star Trek history proves a disappointing movie is usually followed by a good one. The most successful Star Trek movie came after one of Star Trek's biggest flops. Star Trek Section 31 Rachel Garrett won. Counterintuitively, some of the greatest movies in Star Trek history came on the heels of Star Trek's greatest film flops. In the 56 years since Star Trek, the original series went off the air in 1969, Star Trek has released 14 movies. Up until Section 31, those movies have all been either direct continuations of or spin-offs from existing Star Trek TV shows, featuring the same characters. To the extent that Section 31 is a continuation of anything, it is Star Trek: Discovery, where Emperor Georgiou was first introduced. Star Trek movies have some pretty high highs, but also some pretty low lows. Before Section 31, the Star Trek: The Next Generation movie, Star Trek: Nemesis, was ranked as the worst Star Trek movie. Nemesis came out in 2002, immediately before the highest-grossing Star Trek movie, Star Trek: 2009. Similarly, while Star Trek: The Motion Picture was far from a flop, in the grand scheme of Star Trek movies it's by no means the most iconic. But its direct sequel, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, is the greatest Star Trek movie of all time. The Star Trek Origins movie has a more interesting premise than Section 31. And it's well connected to the rest of Star Trek. On top of the general trend for good Star Trek movies to come close on the heels of disappointing ones, the next Star Trek movie also has an awesome premise. Right now, we don't know much about the next movie in the franchise, but what we do know seems super interesting. We know the next Star Trek prequel movie is going to be set on Earth, for the most part, and we know that it is going to tell the story of how humanity first began interacting with alien life. That story is so interesting that there is already a Star Trek movie and TV show addressing it, Star Trek: First Contact and Star Trek: Enterprise. But there are 88 years in between First Contact and Enterprise, and that is an 88-year gap that this new movie could fill with an incredible story without being a threat to Star Trek canon. Whereas First Contact and Enterprise largely focus on events in space, the fact that this new movie will be planetside by and large means that it will have a completely new narrative scope. One of the greatest strengths of The Next Generation is Captain Jean-Luc Picard's, Patrick Stewart, unfailing dedication to diplomacy and the philosophical and political antics that follow from it. Setting this new movie on Earth all but guarantees we will see a return to a more diplomatic era of Trek. If one of the greatest shortcomings of Star Trek: Section 31 was that it felt too much like a generic action movie, this coming Star Trek film is primed to make an epic comeback.